Christian parenting.
You know, I've always trusted that God has a plan for my daughter and for my adoption journey with her. And so when things have been really hard, I had He's given me strength to get through those difficult times, and there have been some really hard times. But I also know that He has a plan for her, and that He's working that.
Hey, welcome back, Call to Love families. I am so grateful that you are joining us today. As you know, each week we dive into the practical, the clinical, and always most importantly, the biblical aspects of the adoption and foster care callings. And today we are going to dive into a conversation specifically around mental health and our children who are adopted and how they are impacted by some of the most pressing and prevalent mental health concerns that we are facing today in our culture. And so joining me for this conversation is my new friend, Hally Wells. She is a retired school counselor and empty nester who writes about faith, parenting, and mental illness. She works for a children's services board, which funds mental health services and programs to her Missouri County's kids. She has experience with adopted, step, and foster kids, and she helps overwhelmed parents find practical answers, impactful resources, and faith family support, all packed into divine wisdom, leaning into the Lord. I am so excited to have this conversation with you, Hallie. I believe it's going to be so encouraging for our families. Thank you so much for being my guest today. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. I was so grateful that you reached out and you brought a couple of different options of topics to me. We're kind of going to mesh those together because I believe ultimately that as we talk about how to help our kids succeed in the mental health sphere, that there's so many different aspects to that. So I'm looking forward to diving into that. But first, let's have you just allow our listeners to get to know you a little bit. Tell us your story, how you came to adopt.
Okay. My husband and I were married a little bit older, and so immediately after marrying, we wanted to start a family. It was about 4 years before our son was born, and there were a lot of fertility treatments and procedures and protocols and things along the way in order to make that happen. Shortly after he was born, we started to try to conceive again, and I had a miscarriage. And I think that there had been others. This was one that, as often happens, we announce a pregnancy, and then very soon after that, something has happened. We announced too early. We had the miscarriage, and I felt the Lord telling me that was the last pregnancy, and that it was time to stop doing the fertility things and to seek adoption. And so we became connected with an agency that did adoptions through Romania, and we did all the things to apply for that, and we were just about ready to get our assignment for a Romanian adoption, and they shut the doors. We received a call from the lovely lady at the adoption agency, and she said, "I'm so sorry, they've just done a moratorium on adoptions, and they won't be doing any more adoptions from Romania." So she
Wow.
said, "I understand that there are a lot of adoptions taking place through Guatemala, and would you be interested in doing that?" She had not done that, but she said she'd be willing to take that leap and make that change and trip for us if we wanted to be the first family. And so we talked a little bit about that, because there were definitely going to be some different considerations with
Right.
being a dark haired, dark eyed person. I knew that a Romanian child would not obviously be adopted, and I knew that a child from Guatemala would. And so, you process that, then it becomes something that everybody can observe and notice. And how do you handle that? And my daughter's 24 years old. So now we're very accustomed to seeing families with different skin tones within the family, and that wasn't as prevalent then. And so we did think about that. How would we handle that? And I have to tell you, there was this very unusual question and that we were asked at the time, and I've asked a lot of parents of Guatemalan adoptees if they'd ever had this asked, and they hadn't. But the lady from the adoption agency said, now in Guatemala, they rate skin tone from 1 to 4, 1 being the lightest and 4 being the darkest. Do you have a
Oh,
concern
wow.
about that? Is really, and we said no, we didn't, because those children are either more European Spanish, or they're more Native American Mayan, Mayan Indian, and so their complexion, skin tones do vary. And my daughter happens to be darker amongst her Guatemalan peers, so that was really I. Nobody else had ever experienced that question, so it was kind of strange. At least I haven't found anybody that had that asked. But so
Yes.
we shifted gears and we brought our daughter home when she was 4.5 months old, which was very young. And of course, again, at that time, the idea is, and still people say, well, when did you get her? When did she come home? And we know
Yeah.
that uh, at the time, well, you thought, oh gosh, she's not going to be impacted by trauma or anything. That wasn't something we knew about. And now we know that trauma is in utero and in those very early months. And so it's not, doesn't mean that much knowing that your child came home very, very early. They still are going to be impacted by the experience of being adopted. So,
That's right.
mhm.
Yes. I so appreciate that perspective and how interesting. And I love the insight that was there for your process for them to ask those questions for your consideration when you began to shift and understand that you were going to bring a child into your family that did not favor you in terms of appearance and
Right.
likeness. And so I think that's really important and that does impact mental health. And we can dive into that a little bit more. Listeners, most of you know this, but if you're new to Call to Love, I also am parenting a daughter who looks nothing like me. She's Pacific Islander, so very dark hair, the very tan skin, very clearly that Pacific Islander look. And so we have run into those conversations as well. And I think it is very prevalent in the adoption space for children to come into families where there's a very clear difference. So there's a very identifiable difference about that family dynamic that cause question and can cause concern for us as parents and our children to have a lot more questions about their story and their adoption experience. So let's lead into all of that and tie it into what we're talking about today, which is the most prevalent mental health concerns that are faced by our youth. And then for our kiddos who are adopted, how that's affecting them, especially. So Hallie, having worked as a school counselor and just currently in the mental health field, what are the most critical mental health concerns that all of our youth are facing right now?
Anxiety, depression, and those things have been definitely exacerbated and just at really incredible degrees over the last several years, particularly after COVID, with the
Yeah.
isolation that a lot of kids experience being home and with their devices or their smartphones, not having the social interaction. So that has really made those issues bigger. Substance use is definitely a concern. We see things, kind of change over the years. When I began my career, things that came up were ladies that were pregnant as teens and they were concerned how do they share that and now that's not such a stigma and so it's not
Right.
something that is as big a concern for young ladies that have had an unplanned pregnancy. Cutting and self-harm was something that I saw to a larger degree during some of those years when I was still in the schools. Self-esteem issues, but now it's being vulnerable to the things on social media. um, just the unhealthy conversations, the bullying, whether it's on social media, on the telephones, in the schools, anxiety, depression, isolation, trauma, just those kind of things we see most prevalent within
Yeah.
all populations of our kids, our youth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think that's a surprise to any of our listeners, but I think it's so important that we keep the reality of that in the forefront of our minds as we're parenting our kids. Many of us have biological children in the midst of blending with foster and adopted kiddos, but we have to have that perspective that it affects all kids while also carrying very carefully that it can affect our foster and adoptive kids to a greater degree as they are processing the extra elements of their story and the family dynamic. And so lean into that for us a little bit, Hallie, of just the importance of understanding how these concerns that you just listed can often be experienced to a greater degree by our foster and adopted kiddos.
They are automatically experiencing a grief, a loss, a sense of what is my identity, how do I fit in this family, in this community, and things like that. So, and they may have more likely have self-esteem issues. they had that one trauma, if nothing else. And some of your listeners may be familiar with Nadine Burke's book, The Deepest Well, which is all about
Hmm.
trauma and how
Hmm.
that impacts kids. And it's a book I would recommend. It also impacts as young people who've experienced trauma grow into adulthood, their health and their lifespan and all sorts of things. And so we know ACEs, we can evaluate one's ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and adoption is the very first one. And being, we know that there's possibly genetic reasons why those kids may be more susceptible to addiction, substance abuse, why they may be more likely to have a mental health diagnosis like ADHD, and that we know can very much impact impulsivity. My daughter has ADHD in all forms. Um, so there's, a variety of things that, we have to take into account: their genetics, their experience of being adopted, just all of those things that impact them and may make those mental health concerns that exist for all a bigger issue for them.
Right. Yeah. No, I appreciate you sharing that. That's a hard weight to carry. And listeners, I want you to know that there's encouragement on the other side of this conversation. So hang in here with us as we're leading with the realities of where most of our kids are finding themselves. And Hallie, I think it's important for us to talk about the fact that many of them are struggling silently. So a lot of our parents might be listening and going, "No, my child is fine. We've had them since birth. They've never struggled with any of the things that you're listing." And so but there can be that internal struggle. So, how do we balance that? We don't want to project these struggles onto our children and
Mhm.
say you should be feeling this because you're adopted, but also not ignoring the fact that they could be and they just haven't figured out how to safely express that to us as their parents.
Right, and there are so many times that our adopted kids want to say things, and they don't know exactly how to say that. They don't want to hurt us, and also for my daughter example, she has a learning disability. I'm not going to say exactly what it is because it was diagnosed very late in her educational career, but she has a hard time expressing, just as you said, communicating and saying things the way that she would want to, and so that's a frustration for her sometimes. Academically, she's usually done pretty well without supports, but communicating is a definite challenge for her. And then, encouraging them, do you want to talk to somebody? Letting them know that that's okay to have a conversation with somebody if they want to, but again, not telling them that that's a necessity. If there's counseling, trying to find that right fit, which is a challenge as well, particularly
Yeah.
as you have an older child. They can be
Right.
rather persnickety about who they want to talk to, and it's not just a matter of let's hook you up with a counselor and see how this goes, because it may not be somebody they feel comfortable talking with. And uh, and and I think, with regard to identifying with the people of their birth culture, also the idea that we want to make that available. We want to let them know that we're open to that. But some children don't necessarily want to connect or want to explore that part of their past as much as
Right.
others. Some embrace that a little bit more, just as they would counseling, or they may not be as open to interaction with their peers from their birth country, or
Yeah.
adopted if they're domestically adopted. They may
Right.
want to set
Yeah.
that over here a little bit.
No, I think that's a great point, and it is something for us to just be mindful of. And we talk about attunement a lot on the show, and just the importance of us as the caregivers, as the parents entrusted with these precious lives, to lean in, to be curious, to know our children, to look for signs that there may be a struggle. Let's pause on that for a moment, Hallie. I don't want to skip over that. Um, of these mental health concerns that you've listed for us that are the most common, what are some signs that maybe for our kids who might be silently struggling, or we see this frequently where the children might have been adopted at a younger age and they have been doing well, they have been thriving, and then all of a sudden something, a switch kind of flips in their teenage years and in their
Right.
early adult years. So, what are some signs that we can be watching for as parents to nudge us to lean in, to be more curious, and maybe to offer some of these extra supports that you're talking about?
Middle school is really, that's a hard time for a lot
Yes.
of kids, and sometimes their peer groups change because if they're not in a small environment, they may be shifting to different schools, bigger schools. That can be really difficult, and kids at that age are so self-centered, and they're and
Oh,
I
yeah.
the better way of saying that, a more polite way, but they're so they all feel like they're being watched and they're being judged and all of that. And so sometimes
Yeah.
when they're experiencing that, they're not tuned into the feelings of others, and they're not being so I would say you'd watch for relationship changes. Are their peer groups changing? Have their friends that have maybe been there for a long time, are those severing? And are the friends that they're now connecting with different? And do you have concerns that there could be some more time with a device or a telephone or a smartphone or something that is taking them away from interactions in their activities?
Yeah.
Are they? Do you suspect any kind of substance use? Uh, Vaping is really scary, and it's not just nicotine that can be the vaping and the e-cigarettes can be used for. So when you see those kind of things, parents should be very aware of what those things look like.
Yeah.
And again, sometimes manufacturers are very smart about disguising what a vape, particularly when those first came out. And probably they're always ahead of us parents a little bit. So trying
Yeah.
to stay educated about what these devices look like, and getting knowledge about what to look for. But I think withdrawal, does your child not seem like themselves? Are they sleeping a lot? Are they not interested in their normal activities? Are there physical signs, weight loss, or things like that that might make you think there's something going on? Anger behaviors,
Yeah.
um, that those kind of things can really let you know something's not right.
Yeah.
They're acting out and treating people differently than they would have normally.
Hey families, Summer here. Sorry to interrupt the show, but I wanted to make sure that you have subscribed. By subscribing to the Call to Love podcast, that means you will get notified with every new episode each week, and it helps me to know that you are here and a part of the Call to Love community. You can also leave my podcast a review and rate it, which helps others to find the show. This podcast is growing thanks to you, and we hope to continue reaching families who are looking for resources as they live out their own call to love. Thank you so much. And now let's get back to the conversation. Yeah, that's really good. It's an important thing, and it's a hard balance to carry of, is this normal middle school slash teenage behavior, or is there something more here? And so I think for me personally, and Hallie, I think you would agree with this, it is better to pursue and be on the safe side and make sure, rather than sitting back and letting them begin to go into darker places where they're going to struggle even more, that would be more difficult to help assist them to pull out of that. So that's really, really helpful. I think too, Hallie, I want to talk about how this impacts adoptive parents, because there can be tremendous pressure that we carry. And I say we because I'm right there with y'all. I carry a lot of pressure to see that my daughter is successful, that she is thriving, that she's happy, that she knows she's loved, she knows she's safe, she's received the proper tools to communicate whatever her experience is at any given point in time. That's a huge weight to carry. So when we see our kids experience these mental health struggles that you've listed for us today, it can feel like a fail. There can be an element of shame. There can be this feeling of just beating ourselves up, like, I didn't do this right. I wasn't the right parent for this child. I mean, like, we ourselves can spiral in a lot of ways, right? And so, how can you encourage us as adoptive parents to respond both towards ourselves and then towards our kiddos if and when they do experience these mental health struggles?
I often think that parents are traumatized too by some of the things that they go through.
Yeah.
As part of a group online with adoptees from the culture that my child is from, and I'm sure they exist for all different situations.
Yes,
But I
I'm on
have,
one too.
yes, and so I've read a lot of the stories, a lot of the sharing of the parents, and it's some of those kids have done so well, and they have grown and been relatively unscathed and happy and well adjusted, and started college and done all these things, and other parents have struggled so much. And I want to say that those parents that have struggled, in most cases, the vast majority, I don't think they've been any less of a parent than the ones who have had it where it's gone very well. And that's
Right.
not taking anything away from the great parenting that some of them does, but I think so many of us adopted parents have done the best we absolutely could, and their child has just struggled for the reasons we talked about before. And so you're right, it can be very embarrassing. You can feel like you failed. You can, but so I think it's important to have that support group, and those other parents have gone through this and understand that you your situation, your child's situation may have just been a little different, and that there's a plan. I've always trusted that God has a plan for my daughter and for my adoption journey with her. And so when things have been really hard, I had He's given me strength to get through those difficult times, and there have been some really hard times. But I also know that He has a plan for her, and that He's working that. And so those kind of things, your faith family, the support of those that know you and know that you've done all the things that you could have done to raise this child in a loving, happy home. You understood the needs and you've researched them and you've tried to stay educated. So all those things are important, but it's important for us to get help too. And maybe while your child is getting some counseling, maybe it's important for you to talk to somebody as well. For us as parents to talk to somebody, because we can be traumatized as well by, what is that phone call that I'm going to get? Has something happened? And sometimes it may not happen, and we're blessed when it doesn't, but you know it can, and it can be really discouraging. And so just prayer and reaching out to support systems and having those people that love you and care for you and love on your child, and then just trying to tap into the resources in your community and figure out how you can educate yourself and better handle the challenges that come up.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great advice. And I appreciate you saying that. It's a hard thing to say parents are traumatized too, because we tend to focus on our child's trauma and bury our own that we might experience through secondary trauma through everything that you just explained, and that honestly could be a whole episode in of itself. I'm going to make a note. I think we need to cover that in another episode, but I think it's an important point, that you're carrying both of those at the same time as you are loving and supporting your child, and then you are experiencing your own journey as well as the adoptive parent. And so yes, community resources, ultimately leaning into the Lord for strength day in and day out. That is the absolute basis of everything we talk about here on Called to Love, is leaning into the Lord as you say yes to that call. So I think that's such an important point. Hallie, I want to circle back to the beginning of your story, and a very important point that you make. You and I share this and similar, and many of our listeners, of parenting children who have a different ethnicity, a different heritage of origin, a different culture of origin, and the importance of acknowledging that, of celebrating that, and how that might help support our children's mental health as they explore their adoption story and experience. Let's lean into that a little bit. Share a little bit more of your insights on that.
I was able to get connected with a group when my daughter was young, and they would do annual reunions in our state where people across the country would come, and it was at a place in a kind of a tourist area in Missouri, and it was so good to for us to meet the parents and for the kids to have activities and to learn about their culture and share a meal that's related to their culture. For us, a quinceanera is a big deal, and
Yeah.
so while some of the parents do that privately in their own families, they also that organization also we had like a mini quinceanera for any of the females that were turning 15 during that particular year's event. And I think it just allows them to understand they're not alone. We made connections with a distant cousin through one of the genetic tests, and then we're able to meet that individual when we were
Oh,
there,
wow.
and they're still connected. We have not found a sister or a brother, and maybe that will happen. It does, from time to time. But just the connection and feeling uh, um, a group of people who understand what you're going through. And we also, they would do things like there was a ceremony, burning of the devil, I believe is what it was. We would call
Yeah,
it, like in
I've
the
seen that.
fall, and we would go to that with a group that was more local. And so we did that a couple of times, and we, would order little gifts for my daughter's teachers that were crafted in Guatemala and things like that. So I think sharing, some of the kids wore stoles when they graduated that represented their country. So knowing that they should be proud of that heritage. Many have traveled back to that country. That's not been something that my daughter has been interested in doing yet. I think, as I mentioned before, some have a higher desire to connect in that way, and others not so much. And I do think, I can think of one an example of an adoptee who's from the same culture who's in a very diverse town. Now, where I live is a very not a very diverse community. And so my daughter was raised in schools where it was largely white. And so I think you have to weigh that. So is it more important that we then pursue these opportunities, or is my child growing up in a community where there's people from all different countries and all different ethnic backgrounds, and maybe it doesn't feel as great a need for them, or maybe it does. So I think
Yeah.
having that conversation, allowing your child to kind of drive that, to say, this is how involved I want to be with this group of folks, and this is, not as much, whatever. But it definitely, along the way, it has been good for us to kind of have those opportunities, have those connections, and spend some time with those folks. And I've let her decide how often she wanted to do that.
That's great. I love that as an option. And that's a really important point about considering where you live and what day to day life looks like. And if your child is thriving in a very diverse area with children who share that same culture and heritage, then it might not be necessary to go to extra lengths. But just having that availability. And I do love the point that you make about there's so many online groups now and communities where you can plug in specifically to your your child's heritage and culture of origin, and there are other parents who are navigating that as well. That has been a blessing for us as well since from day one, and I still get on and engage with those groups, and it really is amazing. Our daughter's heritage, as I mentioned, is Pacific Islanders, specifically the Marshall Islands, and so their big celebration happens when the baby is a year old. And so that's not something that our daughter really remembers.
Mm.
It's called a KMEM, and we learned because there's a high infant mortality rate within her culture and her heritage. And so they celebrate when the baby lives to be a year old. And there's a huge celebration with that. And so we did do that. So she has pictures that she can look back on and we can tell those stories and we can do that. But we have since had other opportunities. Being in the area that we are, there is a large Marshallese population. And so there's activities that we can engage with. So, friends, this is not something for you to go stressing about right now and start frantically looking for things for your child and their culture and their heritage of origin. However, I think this is a really great tool to file away as something to be constantly looking for opportunities just to embrace your child and their story. And I do believe that there is a positive mental health impact as we add that element and that component as we are loving and parenting our kids. So, Hallie, I so appreciate just your willingness to share. Are there any resources as we close out our conversation that you would specifically, you mentioned a book earlier. I would love for you to revisit that and say that title again. And then any other resources that you think would be really impactful around this particular topic that we've talked about today.
Okay. Well, another book that I would recommend, and many, it's very popular right now, is The Anxious Generation by
Yes.
Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah.
And that book addresses how the generation that sort of was born like in the last 20 years, I guess, have been really overparented. It talks about allowing your children to have safe, risk taking endeavors, free play. Free play is a
Yeah.
big thing, and the
Yeah.
smartphones, and how they have been detrimental to our children's development, their brain development, their social development, their problem solving, all of these kind of things. So it's an excellent book. I would definitely recommend that. The Deepest Well is by Nadine Burke Harris, and that's a book about trauma. And she did a study about how kids that were experienced all these different ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and how it impact their development and even into adulthood. And it's been a while since I read it, but it was really good. Um, and I would find out. I work for, as I said, this Children's Services Board in my county. I don't know what's available in other states, but there may be programs that are available within schools. Many of your listeners may be homeschooled, but sometimes those resources for our county, those are available to people who are not in schools as well. So try to find out what's available in terms of counseling, prevention, education, things like that, and take advantage of those things for all your young people, whether they be our adopted ones or otherwise.
That's fantastic. I love that. Okay, listeners, we'll have those in today's show notes so that you can quickly and easily access those. And what a helpful and encouraging and productive conversation, Hallie. I really appreciate you reaching out and just being willing to share your own story and bring this added insight to the show and the listeners. I want to make sure that if they have any follow up questions, they can get in touch with us. So, listeners, there is an email address that is in the show notes week after week, and that comes directly to me. I am so happy to always respond to those. If you have any follow up questions for Hallie, if you would like any more information based on anything we've talked about today, please use that email address, and I will make sure that she gets that information and we will dialogue back and forth with you. It is our pleasure to do that. So, Hallie, I'm so grateful for your time and the work that you're doing and your willingness to share. Thank you so much for being my guest today.
Thank you for having me, Summer. I appreciate talking with you, and it's a fascinating journey. So I just have a heart for parents that are taking this walk and for their kids and how they grow and develop. And so I appreciate being able to talk with you.
Thank you so much for listening to Called to Love today. I love to hear from listeners, and so I would love to connect with you to hear your stories and answer your questions right here on the show. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram, send me a direct message, or send me an email at the link in today's show notes. I pray you have been encouraged by today's episode to walk in faith and continue to embrace your own call to love. Until next time, blessings, sweet friends.